Joining your meeting. Press star 7 to mute or unmute.
Yeah. It's like, no, it's too late to do it.
Kurt replied that he wouldn't be here.
That you would?
Yeah.
Yeah. Manatee usually calls in. I feel like they usually call.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll see.
When do the agendas have to go out? Is it
Next
this
Friday.
week?
Actually, this Friday. And you got all this for me, right? Because I emailed you all the...
Yeah, yesterday.
Okay.
I was looking at it yesterday, but I had all my stuff at the office. Yeah, they have to go out by Friday, or on Friday.
On Friday, yeah.
Holy moly.
And then I won't be here the first 3 days of the week. But I'll be in Thursday to do all the prep
Right.
for everything. But if anything needs to be done, if there's any changes, I could bring my computer and you can let me know what needs to,
Yeah.
you know, it's not a big deal.
When did Al say he was coming back? Is it tomorrow?
I don't remember what he said for this week.
I couldn't remember if it was
I
today
think
or
it was,
tomorrow.
yeah,
I guess
I don't remember him telling me. I think it was like the previous week when he was saying we'd be there Tuesday. But,
Because that's the policy committee item.
yeah. I'll try to follow up with him tomorrow because I need to follow up. He needs to talk to me anyway about the agenda management software.
I'm gonna text him right now.
Okay.
He was on my list to call today.
Kurt sent me a text saying he would be 5 to 10 minutes late. I don't know if that means 5 to 10 minutes late to his destination, because it's a 5 minutes apart and a 5-minute walk.
Well, it's his meeting, so.
Right, okay. Unless the vice chair.
We're here for him. Who's the vice chair? Is it
From
PSDA?
PSDA,
Bob Lasher? Lasher.
How do you remember their names?
I have no idea.
The other thing about names, because you remember their names. I don't remember names. I've known them forever.
I usually don't. I usually recognize faces and can't remember names at all.
Where? Hey, how's it going? I'm gonna leave 2 tables. I mean, they were good discussions, but it's just so weird. There's about 8 people that are 2 people that didn't show up. It's weird.
Maybe you'll be running the meeting today.
Round them up.
That's not fair.
Yeah.
It's not a heart.
Where's Gabby? I don't know.
She's still here, isn't she?
I don't know, because I've been trying to call her and I haven't gotten through. Her message is still on there,
Huh.
so I mean, as far as I know.
They found this one.
I think it's only the last couple
Any interesting takeaways from this one? So what, limited?
No parking or small.
Gee, I think one was
Right on.
both of them chose first station location southwest
Near Robles Park, where the redevelopment. And also kind of tie in. The BRT that'll eventually be in. Station. But no one in our group except for Casey lives in San Francisco. She's fucking much. So no one in our group lives in San Francisco. In our group. We're also talking about doing another one in someone else. Because just as yeah, some.
Is there?
I think she has more than that now. Including there's a lot of the same stuff.
CEOs had a different pitch right now.
Somebody's been looking at mine, sat in it, was maybe funny.
Who would that be? I'm sorry, I don't, because I had two chiefs in there and they both said,
Yeah, it was like cheap.
That's, they did that dance a lot more quick.
You know, it's like, your hair like your hair was really good.
I just asked them and I asked them. Yeah, I don't know, it doesn't fall, but I'm just really.
Yeah, no, yeah. So they don't have anybody that they want to put in here? All right. No, it's okay, it's not your fault. Yeah.
Not gonna be much of a meeting,
Yeah.
except the audience and the presenters.
Yeah. Yep, this is true. Hi. Don, okay.
Sorry, I missed a few.
Huh?
I've missed a few.
Hey, you're here now, so that's all that matters.
Hi, this is Bob Lasher joining.
Thanks, Bob.
This meeting is being recorded.
Have you, this doesn't say a phone number to call into on the invite?
It's on the email. When we send it on the email when we send the packet out. I'll just forward it to her from my email.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Actually, she was gonna do the YouTube.
Here, I'll just forward it to her. So
Okay, thank you.
You're on time now. Huh? I heard you were gonna be late. Well, when you look at the, thing on that says you'll be at 1:45.
Can you drive faster?
Well, I drive a little bit above the speed limit, but traffic was not near as bad as I thought it was gonna be, so that did help.
And you just park on the sidewalk?
No, I always parked in the rule, how you doing? But yeah, I understand what you're saying. How's life at the Barterville? It's going well. Chris guy is just kind of.
Always. It never ends.
All right. I know you now. Do you happen to know, because Michelle is still on here,
Yes.
is she supposed to be coming to these meetings? Is she still part of this, you know? Is she resigned? Okay. So you're the alternate then for her? Because I have you for the TAG group, not the alternate for the TMC group, so.
Isn't this the same group?
I mean, it is, but.
Right. I mean, are there other
Yeah.
meetings that we're not attending?
Huh?
Are there other meetings we're not
No.
attending?
No. I just wanted to make sure that you're technically like her alternate. So, okay. At least I can update my list.
Can you read it? Yeah, I think I can see it all over. This used to be right over here.
Here, I'll put one down there.
No, just was used to seeing it, you know,
Yeah.
it used to be posted right up over.
Can you read that?
I sure can. Thank you.
It just sounded loose. It doesn't say who it is. Yeah. I know Bob Washer's on the phone.
Well, seeing as we've got we're missing a few people, we'll go ahead and start after 5 minutes. So I'm going to call the meeting to order of the TMC TAG joint meeting here at Hillsborough Area Regional Transit, March 10th, today. Persons willing to, now we'll move on to the public, I'm sorry, we need to do a roll call, do we not?
Yes.
So please go ahead and do roll call.
Lon Fry from Citrus County, I don't see him. Paul Simmons.
Here.
So Janina is not attending from Hernando. There is nobody here from Hart due to the recent vacancy, and they don't have anybody that's filling in yet. William Steele or Ryan Suarez from MCAT, are you on the line? Okay. Kurt Scheibel.
Present.
Bob Lasher.
Here.
Tom Phillips. Robert Lewis. And then that's it for the voting side. And I did, record everybody else's attendance that is here. So if we could ask who's on the line, if you could identify yourself, please.
Bob Lasher, PSTA.
Elizabeth Shook, Tyndall Oliver.
And I thought I was a voting member.
Kenneth Ruff, Career Source, Pasco, Hernando.
Yeah. So nothing has changed with who has voting rights. It's still just the TMC. It's people that the vote, the 5 transit agencies are the ones that have the voting. The other ones are just advisory positions.
Perhaps I raised this issue about a year ago that the MPOs needed to have a seat at the table for the TDP. And I thought that's what the TBARTA MPO CCC representative was to do. So maybe I'm wrong.
I can look into that.
I mean, that's what it says here. So I'm not here representing Ford Pinellas. I'm representing all the MPOs.
With that, we would have 2 members present then if we did include you as a voting member. So we still wouldn't have a quorum.
So we'll just go ahead and go on. I understand exactly what you're saying, and I believe you are correct in that situation, but we can take a look at that and move forward. But still, unfortunately, we do not have the quorum as is, so anything taken by the committee today will be as advisory as opposed to actionable. The good news is we only have a action item, but please bear with me, I have a really bad cough going on. Now we're going to the public comment portion of the meeting. Persons willing to address the board are requested to complete a comment card, and there'll be a limited 3 minutes. At approximately 2 minutes, the nice lady inside will kind of point to you and let you know that you have a minute left, and we expect you to wrap up the comments at that time. we'd like you to brief as a group as whole, as not opposed to individual members or to the topics at hand. Is there anybody here in the public that wishes to speak or has filled out a comment card?
No one's given me a card.
If there's anybody here wishing to speak? Seeing none, and we'll move on. For the consent items, we have the minutes from November 12th, 2019. Excuse me. I did not see any errors in the minutes myself, so we'll just go ahead and move on and push that to the next meeting for approval. Action items, I believe we're about to get a briefing from Bill Ball from Tim Oliver. We'll move on, we'll get the briefing and then go forward from there. And then if we have to get an action item prior to that, I'll work with Dennis and see if we can figure out something to make sure this continues on and we don't affect any timelines that you may have.
He must be changing them for you.
Okay, I'm not sure it's picking me up because it's red.
Must be changing them in the back.
Mostly for the folks on the phone, I think. Bob Lasher, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, thanks.
Okay, so maybe we're okay here. Okay, let me, yeah, she has this up here. Okay. Bill Ball with Tyndall Oliver, good to be back in front of the group. Hard to believe that you all haven't met for a while. It's been actually back in November at the last time you all met. So I have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to keep it as high level as I can, but I also want to make sure we cover some good information before we go to the board next week. So this is what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about mostly focusing on the draft report to the executive summary that was in your packets. I want to focus on the regional transit plan itself, the vision plan, and how we brought it back down to a 10-year plan. And then we focus on the call to action and recommendations that go with that call to action. So these are the major tasks that we completed over the past year or so. Gone through this entire process, a couple of phases of public outreach, and now we're getting to the home stretch. This is the executive summary that I'm referring to that's in your packets today. We have, I think, also Jennifer brought some of the copies of these that are up here as well. And really try to keep it at a high level with the executive summary today. We are finalizing a full report that has lots of details as well that will be available very soon. One of the things we talked about with this group before, and we spent time with building consensus with the board, was defining regional transit. What is regional transit? The TBARTA Act is pretty clear on that definition, so we started with that and made sure the board was comfortable with that. And basically, it's any transit project that crosses county lines and any phase of a transit project that will ultimately cross county lines. So that also leaves it open to some discretion and judgment. But the third one is there also provides connections to major activity centers and major employment centers. The board was very comfortable with this definition. They did add a couple of caveats in terms of how they would work more closely with the partners in the region on what those projects are over time. So there'd be a lot of discussions and coordination with the partners as we define that network over time, starting with the Envision 2030 plan we have today. They also wanted to focus the primary market on commuters, regional commuters, and that premium services are the services that should be focused on and providing that service to commuters. So how did we define our projects? We spent a lot of time working on and looking at previous plans and work that were done by the local transit operators and their local TDPs, the MPOs and their long-range transportation plans, various partners throughout the region and the previous work that has been done, as well as public outreach and our technical analysis as well to get to where we are today. And we also applied that definition. What is regional transit? Well, we applied that definition to determine what we propose to be TBARTA's responsibility versus local agency responsibility. So you will see that in the presentation today as well, how we applied that and what that ends up being in terms of a vision for the region. So I have a series of maps here that basically lay out what that regional vision looks like with different types of services. And also this first set of maps focuses on TBARTA's responsibility based on the definition that we apply for regional transit. This first map shows the regional rapid transit corridor connecting downtown St. Petersburg to downtown Tampa to Wesley Chapel. So certainly that is the #1 project for TBARTA today. Secondly, Florida Department of Transportation is conducting these intermodal center studies, 5 different locations along this corridor. So those are added to the Vision network. Next is the other regional rapid transit opportunities. And right now that's in the green and it's largely related to a connection on the Gandy Boulevard. Next are the rail transit, existing rail corridors throughout the region. We're showing those as potential future opportunities in the Vision network. Passenger ferry services. We have the Cross Bay service that's being tested today. We have the potential future connection between Southern Hillsborough and MacDill Air Force Base. And Manatee County has also expressed an interest in looking at a connection between Palmetto and downtown St. Pete as well. So they're included in the Vision. And then finally is the regional express bus services that are indicated in orange on the map. And this is basically the network of services that we're proposing would be TBARTA's responsibility. Critically important also to that are regionally significant local services that we want to highlight as being important parts of the regional transit vision. First of all, there's existing services out there today operated by you as providers that are regional in nature based on the definition that we've applied, and they're indicated in black on this map. We also propose future significant local services that have a role in regional connection, and those are added on this particular map as well. These are local agency responsibility services. And then finally, if you put them both together, this is what we're proposing to be the regional transit vision for the Envision 2030 plan. This includes TBARTA responsibility as well as local agency responsibility services. One of the things this map also shows is an extension of the regional rapid transit corridor to a future. Right now we're looking at that 41 miles, but in the future we're showing an extension further up into Pasco, connecting to State Road 52, and then across the Skyway connecting to Manatee and ultimately into Sarasota County as well. So that's something we've added to the vision that would extend the regional rapid transit that we're looking at today. One of the things we also wanted to highlight, as TBARTA serving as the regional transit entity, is a good one place to look for all of the major transit capital projects that are being evaluated today. So we have created a map to illustrate those projects that are going on already, whether they be regional responsibility or local agency responsibility. So if you look at those major projects that are ongoing or being in development today, you see the regional rapid transit is on there. Central Avenue BRT is on there in Pinellas. The Florida Avenue BRT is on there in Hillsborough. The streetcar extension is on there. And the CSX corridor between USF and downtown is on there, as well as the 2 ferry services that are being looked at. And finally, the 5 intermodal centers that are being studied by Florida DOT. So there's a lot of activity going on in the project planning department, and we thought it would be important to track the status of where they are in their development. So this slide identifies all of those projects and what phase they are in their development, so that we can understand that, for example, Central Avenue BRT is the furthest along in that process, nearing 100% design. And then the other ones are in the planning stages, still working towards implementation ultimately in the future. So we have a vision, a regional transit vision. We've taken that vision and we've applied our tools to basically prioritize alternatives, prioritize transit improvements, and put together a 10-year plan. What is the most feasible improvements for regional transit that we should look at in the next 10 years? And these are the short-term regional priorities that we've identified. And this is based on largely looking at existing regional transit services and potential improvements to those existing services. What you'll see here is that the current operator of those services, as well as the types of potential improvements that could be made to those services, as well as whether they're a primary responsibility of TBARTA in this definition of regional transit, or the primary responsibility of a local agency, which we're showing here as support for TBARTA. So these would be our short-term priorities for integrating into the 10-year TDP. Likewise, we have a number of long-term regional priorities. On the right of this table, you see the 5 new regional express bus routes that we've identified based on our prioritization process, plus some considerations for geographic equity as well. So you'll see that each of these regional express bus routes goes through or touches one of the 5 counties, one or more of the 5 counties. Likewise, the premium transit services that we've identified are indicated on the left as well as the higher priority considerations for the 10-year plan. Okay. At the same time we're looking at the regional transit vision and putting together transit projects, we're also evaluating, okay, what is TBARTA's role going to be in the future? So we spent a lot of time working with the board. We had that board workshop back in November. We've since presented what we heard from the board in January, and we got good high-level direction as to what they envision the roles and responsibilities of the TBARTA board being in these 4 key areas: regional transit planning, operations, funding, and branding. So I want to talk a little bit about each of these and what we heard from the board so you can see where we're headed in terms of their direction. First of all, planning. This is the most straightforward one. Of course, TBARTA is already leading regional transit planning today, and that, of course, is supported by the board into the future, and that would only expand as TBARTA becomes more involved in implementing services in the region as well. On the operations side, we got clear direction from the board that services that are funded and implemented by TBARTA should be contracted out for operation, whether it be a local provider that's already providing services in the region or a private provider, depending on the nature of the transit service being provided. They also has directed staff to determine if there is a niche or a need for regional transportation disadvantaged services that aren't being met well by local providers today, and if so, pursuing how TBARTA could fill that need in terms of regional transportation disadvantaged trips for those with disabilities and older adults. They also have directed us to work with this committee and others to work on what types of standards should be set for regional services. Funding, of course, this is the most challenging one. We did get some clear direction from the board. At a high level, we got 4 recommendations, and they're indicated in the green area on this slide. Basically, the first one is talking about TBARTA becoming a designated recipient for funding from the federal government. And TBARTA has initiated that application, and that application is in process. Secondly, they wanted to have TBARTA do a better job of conveying the value that it brings today to each of its partners and the potential value they can bring in the future if Envision 2030 is implemented. We'll talk more about the value proposition here later in the presentation. We also need to work on communicating more regularly with the partners in the community so that, and you'll see that all over the recommendations that we have at the end of the report, is more regular presentations to each county, MPOs, transit agencies, and the regional entities that are already in place to work with TBARTA. And then finally, of course, the biggest need is understanding and identifying and pursuing dedicated and sustainable funding for TBARTA. And that's in two areas. If you look on that left side, we need funding for agency operations, their day-to-day services, that they're currently getting an earmark from the state on an annual request basis. And then secondly, if they're going to fund and implement projects, then we need a more dedicated funding source to make that happen and leverage additional state and federal grants in the process. On the branding side, clear direction from the board that in their ultimate vision, they would love to see a seamless connection experience for all who use transit in the region. And what that means in their minds is a single unified transit brand ultimately. They also recognize that would be a challenge in the short term, so they see some sort of co-branding agreement that would occur for regional transit services that are implemented in the near term. Okay, I mentioned the concept of value, and we spent a lot of time, and I didn't include it in the presentation today, but there's been a lot of work by the Tampa Bay Partnership on the regional competitiveness of the Tampa Bay area versus other regions around the country. And what we wanted to show was, when you look at the results of that, Tampa Bay does not fare well when you look at transit use and transit supply. They're near the bottom in all of those categories. So we wanted to start looking at what's the value that TBARTA brings today when we talk to our partners, and then what's the value can we bring in the future if and when we're able to implement Envision 2030. So first, without TBARTA, we have no one that focuses on regional transit planning, regional transit vision, and implementing regional transit services. Now, that doesn't mean that the local providers aren't providing some regional services today. They are, but granted, their priorities are providing local services. So the idea of having an entity that's focused on regional connectivity just makes a lot of sense. And having them, that be their priority, their number one priority. Of course, TBARTA is also the commuter services program in Tampa Bay. They have over 170 van pools today, so that's really grown and doing very well. And there's opportunities for that to continue to play a role throughout the region as well. So there's great value already being provided today with the first ever regional transit development plan being led as well. However, it just scratches the surface of what we could be in the future in terms of value. If you think about if we were able to implement Envision 2030, what would that mean for this region? The bottom line is, we could actually move the needle as it relates to job accessibility in the region, to stimulating economic development, to providing opportunities for regional connectivity that we just don't have today. So that's ultimately the goal of Envision 2030, is improving the quality of life opportunities for both residents and visitors to the Tampa Bay region. All right, so how did we approach the 10-year plan? Since we don't have a lot of funding for TBARTA today, we decided the best approach was to put together 3 scenarios to talk about different levels of investment in regional transit, and then see what is our gap in funding if we pursue any one of these scenarios. So the first one, there's 3 scenarios: status quo, a low impact scenario, and a high impact scenario. And that's the ones I want to describe at a high level with you today, and then talk about how much they cost based on the assumptions that we made. Of course, the status quo is continuing what TBARTA does today. You can see the description here, but continuing the commute Tampa Bay services, the van pools, and the planning activities that TBARTA is already supporting. And there's really no additional revenues over and above what they're able to get today on an annual basis. The second one, the low impact scenario. We start assuming that TBARTA will take on some responsibility for some existing regional transit services. In this example, and it's a scenario for consideration in this plan, is the idea of TBARTA starting to take on the responsibility for some of those existing regional services, like the 100X and the 300X. And then making improvements to those services based on the plan that we have today. The capital side would include requirements to operate those services, and then planning would continue, and we would take more closely at that transportation disadvantage need for the region if there is a gap that needs to be filled. We did make some assumptions on revenues here. By doing this TDP, TBARTA becomes eligible to start pursuing the state block grant funding. And then we would need interlocal agreements with the counties so that we can ensure that there is local funding in place to match that state block grant. So this does assume that what is more optional today for the counties would become a more formal agreement to allow TBARTA to have that commitment for local funding for the match of that state block grant. Okay, the high impact scenario, which of course is the one we would love to see implemented as part of Envision 2030, it would include the low impact scenario plus the implementation of those 5 new regional express bus routes that were on that previous slide, as well as the first phase of the Regional Rapid Transit Project, which we've assumed at this point to be downtown St. Pete to downtown Tampa. So we recognize that where we are with Regional Rapid Transit is not likely to be implemented on the length of that 41-mile corridor within the next 10 years. At least that's up for discussion, of course, but that's what we've assumed to be the first phase. Excuse me. There is a lot of capital associated with those investments that would be necessary in the high impact scenario. And we also assume the passenger ferry services that would be capital investments are shown in the plan in this high impact scenario, whereas the operations are assumed to be a private provider as they currently are doing under the demonstration. Planning would continue as only expand to support the needs of this higher investment scenario, as well as the staffing would be needed to expand to support TBARTA operations. For example, what we did assume in new revenues here was the discussion of TBARTA with the local operators about getting some share of the regional population that goes into the equation for state block grant. The precedent has been set for that in South Florida, where Tri-Rail they get about 10% of the regional population in their formula. So anyways, it's a possibility that we could explore here and discuss with the local providers as well. So that would increase the state block grant, which then would increase or need the increase in the local contribution to match that increased grant as well. And then of course there is some limited revenues associated with implementing the service, the fare revenues, so on and so forth. But there's not a lot of new revenues identified in this scenario at this point, which is where we are now. What is the cost of each of these scenarios so that we can talk about what the funding gap is at this point and have that discussion about how we might fill that gap. So this map is of the high impact scenario. And it gives you an idea of what we're proposing to be the adopted plan that TBARTA would pursue over the next 10 years and everything that would be required to make that happen. So let's talk about the operating costs associated with each of those scenarios. If you look at this particular table, you can see that the cost for each of the scenarios goes from about 40, and again, these costs are for the entire 10-year period. We just accumulated all 10 years of the cost so you can get a feel for the magnitude of the investment. And it goes from $42 million in the status quo to $68 million in the low impact scenario to about $156 million in the high impact scenario. And then below that, you can get a feel for the deficit is for each of those scenarios. We are balanced in the status quo. There was a typo in what was posted on the website. So the unfunded part of the low impact scenario, it should be 12.8 as it is on my slide. If you printed that, then I would just mark 12.8 where that number is on your current slide. And then, of course, there's a big deficit in the high impact scenario because significant funding would need to be identified for us to pursue that high impact scenario. This is the operating side. Likewise, on the capital side, the capital investment cost goes from about $5 million in the status quo to $13 million in the low impact scenario to nearly $400 million in the high impact scenario. That's really the impact of that major regional rapid transit project starting to be implemented, where the big capital investment occurs. So you can see the magnitude of the unfunded portion of these scenarios goes up dramatically with the high impact scenario. Okay, when we got to the end of this report, we wanted to be very clear on what the call to action was and what the specific recommendations are as it relates to each of these action items. If you look overall, we had 13 action items identified, 26 recommendations. And I'm not going to go through all of them one by one, but I will highlight the actions and mention some of the key recommendations, and then we'd be glad to discuss any of them in greater detail. The first, there's three areas basically: policy, funding, and the third one is commitment and collaboration. First, policy. We have 4 action items here, largely related to adopting Envision 2030, getting endorsement from the committees before it gets adopted, and then looking for support as it relates to policy that help that plan get implemented. What are the key recommendations here? Really, it's again adoption. And then one of the things that we've talked about, and based on our discussions with the ATL, one of the peer regional transit entities in Atlanta, we thought we should recommend a blue ribbon committee that would help guide the implementation as we go from that planning phase where we are now to once we have an adopted plan, and now we need a committee that has representation of key stakeholders around the region that would help guide and make recommendations to the board on implementation of the plan, especially as it relates to helping pursue new funding that would have to occur for the Envision 2030 to be implemented. The second area, funding, call to action. This really ties back a lot to the recommendations and high-level direction we received from the board. But my number one, we need to pursue dedicated funding for TBARTA through the state legislature and make it part of the budget and not an annual earmark that we're not sure is going to happen on a year-to-year basis. If we can stabilize and plan for the future, we need a dedicated source of funding for the agency operations. And what we've identified in the high-impact scenario is the need for that to go from $1.5 million, which is what they've been getting the last couple of years each year, to $5 million level by the year 2030, gradually increasing over that 10-year period. And that's what would be necessary in our minds to if TBARTA is to implement everything we've identified in that high-impact scenario. The other key recommendations I'll mention is the need to pursue interlocal agreements with the counties, formal interlocal agreements, so we have the match dollars for at least the state block grant, and then potentially in the future, a greater commitment for major projects that have a specific benefit to one of the counties. And then finally, I'll mention the need to pursue legislative change for statutory funding. We have precedent in both Sunrail in Orlando and Tri-Rail in South Florida where they've received statutory funding to help commuter rail get implemented and operated. While that legislation is specific to commuter rail, so we would need legislative change to make the regional rapid transit eligible through that possibility. And then the final one I will mention is just, in general, TBARTA needs a dedicated regional funding source beyond what the counties contribute locally. If they're going to be able to leverage and pursue state and federal grants and be competitive, they need that opportunity. And that's what we would see that Blue Ribbon Committee helping to evaluate potential sources that we identify in the plan, and then make some recommendations to the board as to which one we need to push forward with the legislature going forward. Final area, commitment and collaboration. We have 5 action areas largely related to coordination and cultivating support for TBARTA from the TBARTA board, from the legislative delegation, from the grassroots throughout the region, and the business community as well. And that's basically identified here is seeking resolutions of support from our partners, so that when we go to Tallahassee and David is looking to seek this funding, we have that support from our partners throughout the region. Okay, and then really the next steps are, we were hoping to have the discussion with this committee today, get your feedback. We're looking to present the draft to the TBARTA board next week, next Friday, the 20th. It is the draft, and at that point we would open up a 30-day public comment period for public comment, stakeholder comment, agency comment, and ultimately we're looking to go back to the board for adoption in May, and So we have some time to take feedback from this group and others to make adjustments to the plan as we prepare for that adoption in May. With that, we'd glad to answer any questions and look forward to any discussion. A lot of information.
Does anyone have any questions? The only question, oh, I'm sorry, did you have a question, sir?
I do. On the low impact scenario, Bill, you had said that TBARTA would assume the responsibility for the 100X. Is that HART routes? Are those HART routes?
PSTA routes
Oh,
today.
they are.
Yeah, that's why I say that is a scenario that would require a lot of coordination and discussion between TBARTA and PSTA to see if they would even be interested in doing that. But in the end, if our ultimate vision is to have a regional entity responsible for regional transit, then ultimately they should be the ones responsible.
So you're looking for the agency to actually just turn over the regional routes that they have in place already?
In the ideal world, that would happen at some point in time when everybody feels it's the appropriate time for that to happen. And then it may turn out that TBARTA would turn around and contract with PSTA to operate it. But eventually getting all of the regional services under one umbrella is what we think makes the most sense for the long-term vision.
I have a couple of questions.
Press your button.
Bill, I had a couple of comments on what's in the plan. I didn't see anything for US 19 North in the regional network, US 19 North, and then the Gateway Intermodal Center. You have the West Shore Intermodal Center, but we also, that's one of the 5. And we are prioritizing that this year to ask DOT to begin negotiations with appropriate landowners to identify that Gateway Intermodal Center site.
If the Gateway Intermodal Center is further along than I realize or we realize, then we should.
Well, I mean, we're putting it in for the new 5th year of the work program.
It should be in this 10-year plan.
But that'll be timed when the I-275 is under reconstruction and about the time that the regional rapid transit potentially could begin, begin the funding process. For US 19 North, we've talked very little bit with Pasco County about a partnership there. And I'm afraid that if you're not showing it in the 10-year TDP, it hinders our ability to work as partners and go to DOT with a request for a joint participation agreement to get that service going. And we may not be ready.
You took one of my questions.
Yeah, it may not be ready tomorrow or next year, but within the next 3 to 5 years, I would hope we'd be ready to commit some local funding and make that happen.
And I can even see it going all the way up into Hernando. That's how, I mean, I think that type of service would be successful.
Are you referring to this as an express bus?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Now, we do have that indicated here as a local agency responsibility improvement, so it should be showing, it would be showing under that under the black lines.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're suggesting is we consider it for inclusion in the regional?
Well, I mean, it's kind of like the 100X and the 300X. I mean, it's operated by PSTA. PSTA operates service. Pasco operates service. If we're going to improve it, first of all, we've got the roadway being redesigned by DOT now, and we're having a debate about whether we're going to build more interchanges or at grade. And part of the argument for building at grade is it supports transit much better than the overpasses do. So I kind of need all the ammunition I can get.
I think that makes sense, and we can certainly make an adjustment to reflect it so that it supports your.
Okay. And the last point I wanted to make real quick is on Friday we had a meeting of the TMA leadership group of all the MPOs in the region, and Hillsborough MPO brought forward an item for discussion, which was a regional phasing plan for new starts, small starts, applications to FTA, so we're not tripping over each other, submitting projects in the same year. And what it was really just a heads-up information item, but what we agreed to do is to keep that item on the TMA leadership group agenda twice a year to revisit it, because you do that maybe in the beginning of the year and then again at our last meeting in November, because things tend to change over the course of a year. And for instance, we've got the 34th Street South bus rapid transit project we've gone through the lane elimination process at District 7 to look at setting aside a lane for transit operations. It's already got 15-minute frequency in the peak hour during the day. So if we could convert one of those unnecessary lanes down there, that's ready to go today and doesn't really need an operational commitment to enhance transit service, at least up to a point. So I guess I just wanted to put it on everybody's radar screen that the MPO directors are talking about a phasing process for applications to FTA. And this ought to kind of feed into and guide that process, or vice versa. But there needs to be that recognition.
That's kind of what we started to do when we showed those regional projects on one map, on one Gantt chart, to show where they're at in their development process.
Okay. Yep.
So if we're missing anything on those that we should add, I think it covers the major ones that are.
They were talking about the streetcar extension, the regional rapid transit, the HART BRT, arterial BRT,
Right.
and Central Avenue BRT, CSX.
I think we have all
Yeah,
of those.
and Waterborne was listed as a potential. Okay.
Yeah, I wish I had been at that one. That sounds like it would have been.
It was actually a productive discussion.
Yeah.
I just want to piggyback a little bit on what he was saying, is that PSPT is looking at a express bus service heading up and down 19 to connect to their proposed express bus service. Again, it won't be this year, it won't be next year, but I can see it in a 3 to 5 year period on there, and having it on there.
Long-range plan for a long time.
Yeah, I know. Well, I'm talking more though, even beyond the 15-minute service, but just a limited stop express bus service that provides great coverage down. And whether it's, we provide a bus and PSTA provides a bus and we just both do the same route type of thing, or what, there's a lot of ways to make this happen and make it very attractive to those transit choice riders who would do there. So sitting in 19 traffic, they can now sit there and play on their phone or something. So that's going forward from there. The one thing I want to make sure that we're clear on for the next meeting is what, because you have 15 recommendations and a whole bunch of different action items. What action items you really want us to vote as this group here? So if you can clarify that for the next meeting, so that when you go to the 15th meeting, you'll have a clear voice from the tag going forward. And I think that would just make your message a whole lot stronger. So
We would love the committee to endorse and support the plan and its recommendations.
yeah.
But my one concern is the frequency with which this group meets is not very.
Well, I'm gonna talk to David about that. We probably should have a meeting and then make a big effort for all the members to actually show up in person for this meeting, because it is a vital part of TBARTA and a big voice on TBARTA's future, that we should actually, as regional people that are helping support this, should be here and giving that and saying our voice, yes or no, and giving our opinions, and as opposed to being on the sidelines and maybe saying other comments that, you know, let's make sure we're getting people here. And I will talk to David and see if we can get some more voices out there, because I agree with you. This is something that's been needed for a long time, and let's make sure that we are supporting it as a region. Because talking to FDOT, that's the biggest concern they have, is we need a regional voice, and making sure we're saying those regional things going forward.
And we're doing our best to, we're already on the agenda for PSTA's board in April, so that, and we're trying to do the same part as soon as we can get on their board as well.
I'd also recommend
We're
getting,
gonna be able to do all of those before the adoption that's planned in May, the TBARTA.
and also I'd recommend though that if you need to, I can help with that, getting it on the Pasco MPO board meeting, probably not this month because it's like tomorrow or the next day, but next month in April too. So if you need some help with that, please let me know and I'll be glad to assist. And since we can only advise on this part, is there any other questions before we move on to the next item? So
I have one question. I need Bill. Sorry, I need Bill to speak up a little. I'm having trouble hearing him. But can you just elaborate a little bit more on who would be on this blue ribbon committee? I'm kind of curious about what the makeup is, or maybe haven't gotten yet.
Sure, we've only had discussions at the staff discussions where we wanted some really strong business and citizen stakeholders to be on this committee. And basically, individuals that have a certain level of experience that they can bring to the table to this Blue Ribbon Committee to provide guidance and recommendations to the board. So that's kind of what our high-level discussion at the staff level, but we haven't taken that to the TBARTA board to get their input as to what they would like to see. If you want to add anything, Dave, kind of what we discussed at this point.
All right, thanks. Bill, I'm still having trouble hearing you.
First of all.
This thing needs to be followed.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, we haven't decided who is going to be appointed to the board, but we thought that it was important that TBARTA's board members were the ones who appointed people to the Blue Ribbon Committee. And there are a couple of different options. One is that each board member just appoints somebody of their interest, similar to how they do for the Citizens Advisory Committee. Another option that we tossed around was the idea of interested parties applying to TBARTA, being vetted by staff, and then being recommended to board members via TBARTA staff. But ultimately, we wanted the TBARTA board members to make the final appointments.
Thank you. I like the sound of that.
Any other questions from anybody? Well, Bill, thank you. Sorry we can't do more than just say thank you. Good job on this, and we look for more good stuff going forward.
The one thing I would suggest is perhaps we send a follow-up to all the members, and maybe I'll give it to Jennifer and give you a date for some comments that we would like to have those comments by, written comments, basically. In addition to another meeting, if that's what you choose to do.
Well, I would suggest that probably we should do another meeting to meet in a, kind of a public/formal environment to make sure our views are yay or nay or indifferent on what moves forward. That way we can get a good vote. Like I said, the whole idea of having a vote in support of, all it does is gives you more ammunition for when you actually reach to the board, because we are the ones eventually that are going to have to, where, if you pardon the expression, put the rubber meets the road and implement whatever comes out. So that would be my recommendation going forward, unless somebody has something else going forward. But we'll try and put some type of push and see if we can get another meeting moving forward before the next the TBARTA meeting in May.
Thank you.
Next, the next presentation we have is by Christina Kopp, if I pronounced that name right, and Innovative Transit Technology Feasibility Study Update from WSP.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me today. Hopefully this is an interesting topic for you as we're talking about emerging technologies. Just to give you kind of a framework on what the presentation is going to be over, we are conducting a feasibility study for TBARTA on some innovative transit technologies. And today we just want to provide you with an overview of the study itself, where we are in the process, and then kind of set a primer of what these different technologies are, where they are in the development process, and what we can expect as the study progresses. So to be specific, when we're talking about innovative transit technologies, in relation to this study, we're specifically talking about 3 technologies. One is the aerial gondola, which is something that it's actually the only one of the technologies that currently exists and are in operations today. And then the other 2 are air taxis and Hyperloop. Right now, we are in the process of doing 2 efforts simultaneously. We're doing a lot of the technology research, which involves literature reviews, going through a lot of technical data, and also talking with a lot of the developers and folks that are other agencies that are doing studies themselves to find out where they are, what they're actually seeing, some lessons learned with some of those. So we'll first start out kind of giving an overview of the cable-propelled transit. That's the overarching type of transportation that the aerial gondolas fall under. This is just anecdotal information here that it's actually been around since the 1600s. Everyone thinks it's innovative. It's been around for a long time. Whether we see it here in the U.S. in an urban setting or not, it is utilized globally. We see them typically here in ski resorts and tourist destinations, theme parks, as I'm sure you have all experienced. But there's also lots of benefits and concerns based on the operations of these aerial gondolas. Some of the benefits, just to kind of step through some of these. One of the reasons that they're used throughout the world are to address issues in geographic barriers of some sort, whether it's water, mountains, some level of inability to provide access. So that's where they're traditionally used. They also help, obviously, provide that transit option over congested roadways as well. Anywhere where there's limited right-of-way, since the towers really don't require a lot of space, they generally have low operating and capital investment costs, and they are generally safe. Actually, in Switzerland, they compare them to their other technologies for transit, and they're the safest of all their transit technologies. As I mentioned, accessibility, that's actually one of the key features, one of the key benefits to this. Some of the concerns, one of the things I would say highlight is one of the top concerns, especially being here in the Tampa Bay area, is weather. We always have thunderstorms, lightning, high winds, especially during hurricane season, so that would be a top concern for the technology, especially when you look further down on that list with evacuation. So wanting to make sure that as it's operating, that people don't get stuck in the middle of any kind of traveling. Privacy. And really the privacy aspect comes into play with a lot of these technologies. It comes into play with the air taxis as well, that I'll discuss later, because this is just a technology, it's in the air. So in many instances, it's traveling over residential areas or areas where people work. And that's just generally something that people don't, it's kind of the not in my backyard type of mentality, not wanting people to be able to overlook onto their property. System flexibility and expansion. If you are looking at this from a long-range planning perspective, the systems themselves have to really be planned out. They aren't easily expandable. So if you want a 5-mile gondola system, you'd have to pretty much have it planned out. It's not something that you can just add on to through the years easily. Perception and issues and view sheds, I touched on that already. And then the maximum speed. They are not fast compared to some of the other technologies. And I'll show you a comparison here in a moment. The technology itself is pretty simple. It's basic components. There's 3 main components to the technology. You have the cabins of various sizes. You have cables, and you have towers. Other than that, the only other infrastructure component is really the stations. The 2 main stations that you have to plan for, the drive station, that's where you have the electric motor housed. And then you have the return station, which simply put is where the gondola can return back to the drive station. Depending on the size of the system, you can have intermediate stations, just based on providing opportunities for people to get off and on the system. And then angle stations, which really that's pretty simple. It's just if the entire line needs to make a turn, then you have to have a specialized angle system to help that do that, facilitate it. The amenities are pretty similar to other transit options. Lighting, Wi-Fi, air conditioning. Well, air conditioning is a little patchy, to be perfectly honest. Sometimes it's a little troublesome to get functioning correctly in the gondola systems. A lot of the real-time passenger information. One thing that I thought was interesting from this, especially when they look at some of the urban gondola systems, is the smart glass. They even have technology where the glass will fog up so that the folks that are in the actual cabins can't see the residential or businesses around them, and that helps to address some of those privacy concerns. So when I was talking about speed, As this shows the monocable, bicable, and tricable, the maximum speed is anywhere from 14 to 17 miles per hour. But you also can see that the maximum capacity is actually quite a bit more than an aerial tram, which can actually seat 28 people in one tram, but has a lower capacity as far as a vehicle. As I mentioned, there's quite a few applications of this technology in ski resorts. We're not focusing on that for as an innovative technology, so to speak. So we're not showing that on the map here. But we did want to show, just to highlight where these are actually operating in the U.S. today. You have Portland, the Portland tram, and then you also have in New York City the Roosevelt Island tram. The green areas are, the circles are just showing specifically where there's been conversations, where there's interests, and some of the communities have pursued studies or grant funding in some way to try to implement a gondola system. If you come down to Florida, we did want to highlight two in orange. Orlando, specifically over at Disney, as I'm sure you're all aware, has implemented their gondola system. With certain issues that we're actually going to be interviewing them this month to see if we can get some lessons learned from their experience. And then in Miami, they actually implemented a pretty short gondola system that was for the Super Bowl, and it is purely used as an attraction at this point. And then, of course, in St. Pete, there's been lots of conversations of gondolas. I think there was even a Tiger grant submitted a few years back. So onward towards air taxis. When I talk about air taxis, I really like to actually put this under the framework of urban air mobility, because it is a larger conversation that's happening right now. Again, some anecdotal information. This is not a new conversation. It certainly hasn't been, it's a new technology, but it's not a new conversation. It's something that we've been talking about for a while. We've certainly had helicopters that have been providing passenger service, not as widely used, but the next evolution of this is going to be what they call electric vertical takeoff and landing technology. So to get into that a little bit, this is what is really spurring this market into being able to be a reality in the next 5 to 10 years, is that ability to basically take off vertically easily, noiselessly, and also provide cruising that provides people with real transit opportunities. Also reduced emissions. Helicopters, that's one of the biggest issues with them, really providing any kind of on-demand service in downtown areas. The longer lasting batteries have also played a key role in making this technology possible. There's a lot of noise out there, no pun intended, with a lot of this technology, because pretty much every day there's a news article, there's a new company talking about doing this, there's reports anywhere varying between 100 and 170 different developers in this realm in some way. The thing, I guess, to kind of cut the noise a little bit, just to explain, there are a lot of developers, but there's different types of developers. So I wanted to just take a moment to talk about some of the different types of VTOL air taxi developers. So the first one is the multi-rotor. The multi-rotor is, it's basically really good at hovering. It has a circulator actuator. It has a cruising speed of 50 to 80 miles per hour, but it doesn't have any wings, which is why it has some of the issues cruising. Its typical range, though, is only 10 miles to 25 miles. So when there's some of these companies like eHung or Volocopter that you'll hear a lot about, the multi-rotor can really provide some great on-demand service, but it doesn't really have much of a range. So you're going to see it more typically in urban settings or providing kind of short-term business type trips. The second type of technology is the lift and cruise. It has two different types of propulsion systems, one for the hovering portion and one for the cruising. The speeds are definitely there with 110 to 180 miles per hour, and it does have a range of 50 to 60 miles. The problem, though, is that it has those two different propulsion systems, and it still requires an actual takeoff. So when you're thinking in terms of an urban area, going through different, from tops of buildings or vertiports, it's a little more challenging to really build that into the infrastructure. So that's when the vector thrust type of vehicle comes into play. And that is the fixed or tilt wing, where you only have that one propulsion system for the actual vehicle. A lot of these companies that you're hearing that are working with Uber, like Lilium, Joby, Bell, Nexus, these are the ones that you've probably heard more about in the news recently because of this ability to provide more of that on-demand type service. They have the same cruising speeds as the lift and thrust, and they have the same range of 50 to 60 miles per hour. The interesting thing when you're talking about vector thrust, though, when we get into some of the different type of mobility profiles, is these are typically going to have fewer passengers than some of the other types. So what types of mobility markets we could see in the future? NASA actually commissioned 2 different studies to look at markets, and they were able to categorize 3 very distinct markets for air mobility. One is the last mile delivery. You've all heard about UPS. They're all looking at different kinds of prescription deliveries and things like that that can provide that more of a courier style type service. The air metro and the air taxi. We have the last mile delivery in here. Really, I'm not going to spend much time on this. This is not the focus of our study at all. But when we get to the regulatory side of this, a lot of the regulations right now are going to be focused on the last mile delivery because it's something that businesses are really looking at, and just that's where they're going to have to start in building the regulatory framework for air mobility. The air metro is one that NASA is spending some time looking at. The way that I would explain the air metro is think of it's similar to a bus transit or a light rail where you actually have predetermined stops. It's kind of like an air corridor. It's not an on-demand type service. So it's going to be a pickup and drop off at a specific time. You're going to have more passengers in this type of service. Usually an average of 3 is what they would predict. And there's going to be infrastructure requirements that go hand in hand with an air metro style market. You're going to have vertiports throughout downtowns, certain office buildings that are going to have roofs that are converted so that they can receive some of these types of services, charging and service stations, and then the air taxi. So the air metro is kind of what NASA sees as kind of the first level of engagement with air mobility on a passenger level. And then the air taxi would be further out as from a time frame standpoint because it's going to require a lot more infrastructure. This is that on-demand type of service. So when you think of an Uber or a Lyft, this is the Uber and Lyft of air. It's going to hold, basically, it can hold 2 to 5 passengers, but you're going to see more trips that are just 1 passenger because you can pick up your phone, call an air taxi, and be on your way. As I mentioned, it's going to require a greater investment. So when you're talking about point-to-point, think of the curbside pickups and drop-offs that you see with Uber. You're going to have more vertiports, vertistops they call them, and vertihubs to actually make this a robust and feasible transportation mode. Operations and infrastructure. I wanted to highlight this just because these are components that the locals would probably have to spend time really looking at, and this is where a lot of the local control kind of comes into this. You have a lot of private companies that are developing the taxis themselves and the apps to make them usable. But when it comes to the local control, we're looking at a lot of the zoning because there's going to be a lot of zoning requirements that need to be looked at that aren't in place right now. And figuring out the right place for vertiports, vertistops, and vertipads. Where is the appropriate location for some of these, especially when we talk about noise considerations? The electric charging is actually extremely expensive. It's probably one of the most expensive portions of a vertiport when we look at some of the cost estimates. So that's something that, whether it's a private or public endeavor, is something to consider. operations would be similar to the transit operations, except there would have to be some level of air traffic management system built that isn't in existence today whatsoever. It's only there for commercial, and this would actually be in an elevation lower than typical commercial airlines, so it would be a whole new air traffic management system. This is just, there's a few, if you speak with different air taxi manufacturers or developers, a lot of the pilots and demonstrations are expected to start rolling out in a few years, within the next 5 years at the latest, with a 10-year staged implementation plan. There's a lot to be done. As I mentioned, the air traffic management system is a huge endeavor that NASA's working on right now to figure out what that would look like. But there's also the infrastructure, trajectory-based operations, and then I want to highlight the public trust and acceptance, because it's not necessarily regulatory, but it is something that FAA is really concerned about, and something that they're seeing as one of the most important issues related to this type of technology. And there's things that we're just not thinking of. I like the example here. Elevators don't go to the rooftop, generally. It's just something that a lot of people don't think about. So a lot of how buildings are actually constructed or going to be retrofitted has to be considered if this is going to be a real mobility mode. And then that brings us back to the ground for Hyperloop. Again, this is nothing new as far as a concept. It was, I would say, brought forth again by Elon Musk with his white paper of Hyperloop Alpha, which really basically charged a lot of developers to start testing and figuring out how they can develop Hyperloop and make it a real technology. Generally, Hyperloop is basically a grade-separated vacuum tube. That's the main piece of the infrastructure, with capsules or pods, whatever you want to call them, that will actually travel through the tube. They're autonomous, and they are indicated to reach speeds of upwards of 760 miles per hour. I will just mention that there are only 3 testing facilities in the world, and the highest that they've reached so far is 260 miles per hour in Nevada. I mentioned the propulsion. It is a linear electric motor, but it's also basically a magnetic levitation. There's 2 different types of magnetic levitation. The two primary Hyperloop companies are looking at are the passive magnetic levitation. From an infrastructure standpoint, a lot of the Hyperloop developers are saying that you can use much less right-of-way, because there's 3 ways you can build these. You can do at grade, you can go underground and not worry about right-of-way at all, which we all know it's not that easy. And then you can also go elevated, so that they're actually on piers. They, width themselves, are less than some of the other options, but not by much. It's a little less of a width than the high-speed rail width requirements. Also, one thing that's very important when considering connecting cities with the Hyperloop is the fact that it needs a pretty straight alignment. Once it starts veering horizontally or vertically, it actually requires a speed reduction, which makes it less efficient. The target market is the intercity trip, so it's really competing against the regional air travel and the high-speed rail types of technologies. Some feasibility studies that have been conducted to date are insinuating that you really need between 200 and 500 miles between cities for it to really be an effective system, and that's from a speed standpoint and just from a cost standpoint. So just to put this in perspective, we're about 85 miles away from Orlando. The distance between Orlando and Miami is around 240 miles. And they actually did answer one of the calls from one of the Hyperloop companies, Virgin Hyperloop One, to look at that corridor. Some of the studies have looked at 2 to 3 minute headways. Again, I just like to reiterate that this is not an operational technology. That hasn't even been tested, it's the, based on their analysis, initial analysis. I mentioned a few companies that are in this market. There's 3 primary companies working on Hyperloop technology today. You have Virgin Hyperloop One and Hyperloop TT, which is Transportation Technologies. These are the 2 that are really in the US today, looking, and they're doing different types of feasibility studies throughout our country. Transpod is up in Canada, but they are a player. They've been producing some reports as well. One thing that's been interesting as we've talked to some of these different developers is they really see themselves as the developers. They're not the ones that are necessarily going to come in and build it as the private sector. They're really seeing this as P3 opportunity, it would be a consortium essentially to actually build the Hyperloop. Another map for you, just to kind of give you an overview of where there are conversations across the U.S. The green circles are just where there are feasibility studies. I will just mention, though, up in Cleveland, Chicago, Pittsburgh, that area, there are 2 different studies going on. You actually have Hyperloop One, Virgin Hyperloop One, and Hyperloop TT, and who just actually released one of the most robust feasibility studies in the last, just in January. And that's really been providing a lot of data on some of the technology features from that analysis. There are 2 test sites. One is the Las Vegas, the Nevada test site that Hyperloop One has, and then the one in Hawthorne for SpaceX. There's also conversations going on around the world, as I mentioned. A lot of them really are resonating from Mumbai to Pune. That's a big one. I know that I've seen a lot of conversations about getting under construction in 2020. In talking with some of the Hyperloop developers, that didn't sound like that was a true date for construction, but we'll see. There's also another test facility. The 3rd test facility is located in France, and that is for Hyperloop TT. So, as I mentioned, we're in this research phase right now, but we're going to be completing this quickly and moving into our governance and regulatory review. And we'll be going back to the board in May to give them an update on the study and where these different technologies really stand when it comes to governance. And then we're going to go into a corridor analysis. We're going to look throughout the Tampa Bay region at where there are some really good connections. What are the market areas for each of these technologies? Obviously, with Hyperloop, we'll have to look outside of Tampa Bay just based on the types of service that it provides. And then we'll wrap up the study over the summer in July. So with that, I will take any questions.
Does anybody have any questions for Christina, except for me? The one question I've got is on the helicopter electric one. Are those manned or unmanned?
So the first iteration will be manned.
Will be manned.
Yes, but they are obviously looking towards autonomous, because that would be the most cost efficient.
And the other thing is, being a lapsed pilot and many years in flying around, when you talk about that lower level below the commercial area, that's where most of the private folks go. So the safety concerns that are going to be beyond people flying around are going to be huge concerning that. I.e., Joe Blow gets in his little Cessna 172 and starts flying around and wanders into a major corridor of air taxis. That's where you're going to see that's probably the FAA's major concern, and where they're looking at things and maybe mentioning about that safety, because you kind of said they're kind of working on it. It actually is it would be a pretty big deal, because there'd be a lot of people in that area who do fly in that below 10,000 foot realm is what you're looking for, even below 5,000 foot realm here in Florida, because there's nothing that makes you climb higher. So, excuse me. And then on the Hyperloop, have there been any mention about like the vibrations? Because when you get to the high-speed trains, the biggest thing about it is the vibrations that's transmitted into the ground from the planes going by, the rumble and all the other stuff, the noise. Is there any concern about that?
The focus of the study has been on noise more than vibration. congestion, and of course, the Hyperloop companies don't feel like there would be any kind of noise impact from the transportation within the tube.
Okay. Any other questions then? That's just basic things I had. Okay, well, thank you for the great report. We hope to see some more.
Kurt, I've got one question if I can.
Go ahead.
Christina, out of all of the places that are testing the Hyperloop, are any of the test sites clearly in the lead?
Absolutely. So I would say the Nevada one is in the lead. The test site that Hyperloop TT has in France, actually, it had just finished construction over the last few months, and I think it has done a few tests with bogies, no tests with capsules. So I would definitely say the version 1, it has been up and testing for a while. The SpaceX has been open, but it's really like for smaller capsules. They're doing speed tests, and it's not really focused on it's not focused on the development side.
Thank you.
Anybody else on the phone? Once again, thank you for a great presentation.
Thank you.
We'll move on to the Commute Tampa Bay presentation by Cindy.
Good afternoon. I'm Cindy Raskin, the Director of Commuter Services for TBARTA. And today I just want to introduce you to Commute Tampa Bay, which is the new branding for our commuter services program. For those of you who don't know, we operate the Commuter Assistance Program here in FDOT District 7. We help employers put together commute alternative programs for their employees. We help commuters directly find carpools and van pools and some other kind of commute alternatives. And we work with local governments to try to build better communities that make it easier for people to choose those commute alternatives. Of course, you all, as transit people, transportation people, know the value of commuting by alternative means. It's better for the community, it's better for the environment, reduce congestion. It's great for employers as a recruitment and retention tool. It can lower their payroll taxes if they help offset the cost for their employees. And of course, it's doing the right thing for our community and our environment. So for a very long time, the commuter services program here has just been called Commuter Services. Back when it was Bay Area Commuter Services, it was BACS, and that's what it was. We had this unique opportunity presented to us with the introduction, the procurement of a new ride matching platform. So we decided to launch those two things together, was to rebrand the program offerings so that we could convey our purpose a little better than just calling it commuter services. So the new brand is TBARTA, Commute Tampa Bay. We wanted to be able to tell who we are, what we do, and where we do it. We feel like this branding, the name and the visual really does that in an attractive and appealing way for our customers. And so far, the feedback has been very good. People like it. We introduced a new app at the beginning of February. The vendor is called Agile Mile. It's also the app that's used in District 1 and District 5. So now people within the 3 contiguous FDOT districts can cross-match. You go and create yourself an account, and you have a regular commute to Orlando. It's very possible you could find a carpool match for somebody going into that other district or down to Manatee or Sarasota. This is what it looks like. It's available in the Google Play Store, the iPhone store, and there's also a desktop version that you can log in, commutetampabay.com, and go create an account. So you don't have to have a smartphone in order to access the program. These are a couple of screenshots of what it looks like. The first one is a sample match just going from St. Pete to Ybor City, where we are today. You can see all the little dots. The little purple circles are bike share. There's all sorts of things you can turn on and off here. You can also see electric vehicle charging stations. You can see park and ride locations. Lots of different options. The really cool thing about this program is it invites the users to log their trips, which is the third picture you see here. I probably should have swapped the order of this. So you go and log a trip and you say, okay, today I am carpooling and here's my starting location, my ending location, I'm commuting to work and it's a round trip. The system's going to give you 100 points for that trip. Those points you can use to redeem for prizes, which I'll get to in a second. The middle picture you see here is your own personal dashboard, which shows you the value you've contributed to the community by choosing a commute alternative. So how much money have you saved? How many miles have you not driven? How much gas have you saved? So a lot of people like to see their own valuable contribution to the community, and this is a great place to see that. So going back to talking about the points, you can earn points every time you log a commute trip that's a round trip. And you can turn them in for things like this example, $5 off of 15 at Jet's Pizza. You can also log your trips showing that you're doing commuting, and this is how you're going to now access our emergency ride home program. It costs you 0 points, but you do have to be logging trips. That's how we know that you're actually making your minimum of 2 commute alternative trips per week in order to qualify for the program. We are making some changes to improve the emergency ride home program. For the past many years, it's been 4 rides per year. And we did it by a voucher system. So it was like a 3-part form, and you created an account, and we mailed it to you, and it was kind of crazy to keep track of this 3-part piece of paper in your wallet or in your purse for when you might someday need it. This new program allows you to have up to 6 rides home per year, so 1 every other month, which we felt was a little more reasonable to inspire people to make those commute alternatives. And then we're doing it as a reimbursement. So you would pay for your ride outright. You would go through the app, redeem your 0 points to get a form that you would send in with your receipt. That allows us to make sure the rides are under $100 or less, and allows us to make sure that the program is being used by people who really need it. So basically what you have to do is create your Commute Tampa Bay account and go log in and log your trips in order to qualify for that program. So just quickly highlighting some of the services that our team is promoting. Carpooling, of course. The ride matching system can help you find a carpool partner. People that carpool together work out their own arrangements about who's going to drive, if they're going to exchange gas money, thing like that. We facilitate the match. The rest is up to the carpoolers. Employers can choose to subsidize carpool. If they want to qualify for this as part of the Best Workplaces for Commuters program, which I'll talk about later, they just have to subsidize incentive a minimum of $30 a month for carpoolers. That's just one of many options of what they can do. Van pooling is the one that most people have seen and heard around the Tampa Bay area. We partner with Enterprise, Commute by Enterprise. Our account executive, Arlinda, is here in the room, and she does doing a great job of helping us find van pools and getting them set up. As Bill mentioned earlier, we're over 170. How many are we at now? 177, Arlinda says, as of today. So TBARTA subsidizes the first $400 of the cost of that van, and then the members in the van split the cost between them for the balance of the cost of that vehicle. Now again, employer can subsidize. The actual dollar amount is $270. I have 3 slides on here and I have a different number on all of them. I don't know how that happened. It's $270 now. And a lot of the vans that we have right now, they're actually SUVs, and they are federal employees that are in those vans, and the federal government does have a benefit program where they cover a lot of the cost for our vans. So a lot of these van pool people are getting to ride basically for free as an employee benefit and helping reduce that traffic congestion. Preferential parking is something that we're trying out in front of Paul's office down in District 1. We saw a great commuter reserve parking right in front. We were down there for a meeting the other day, so we're hoping to get some of these put up in our area too. We've made this custom sign where we can add an employer's logo on the left side there. Our first order is probably going to be Tampa General Hospital. They're trying to decide how many vans they want, but Baycare is sneaking up on them. Our Linda and Terry Bowers, our Pinellas rep, are working hard on getting Baycare on board with some vans. And then you have things like compressed, flex, alternative work schedule, telework, all of those sorts of things, especially right now with super timely. People are talking about staying home from work and working from home so they're not touching doorknobs and spreading diseases and viruses. So this is something we can help an employer put together a program like this too, using some best practice documents that are available out in the world. And of course, our favorite, public transit. We partner with our transit agencies. Our account executive team has built really great relationships with your public engagement and outreach people in order to work on events together, give each other leads, talk about, learning about where transit goes, for a particular employer to help them set up pass programs or just get them bus information for their particular area. Bicycling, it's a bike month in the state of Florida right now. There's tons of bicycling events. Bike Walk Tampa Bay is a great organization here locally that organizes all sorts of biking events. In fact, there's one Thursday, I think this week, that's a bike to work in Tampa, so go check that one out. One of the biggest things that we do as the Commute Tampa Bay team is to provide this support for the employers. So we will come in and help develop a program for your employers, help them evaluate the needs of their particular location and their particular employee population to find out if carpool is best. Do they have people coming far enough away in large enough quantities to make a van pool work well for them? Is it someplace that's easily bikeable? Can we help them set up a bike to work program? Basically, any of these items that are listed here, our team can go out and work with employers for those. One of the things we did earlier this year, we hired salespeople that are geographically assigned. So we have Brandon, who does Pasco, Hernando, and Citrus County. We have Terry, who does Pinellas County. We have Keisha, who does Hillsborough County. So they're all building relationships in their territories. And even though they're not selling anything that has dollar value, they're selling a service and a way of thinking about things. They're super competitive about their own regions. So overall, having a geographically assigned has turned out to be really effective, and they're doing a lot of great things. The other thing that's on here that I don't have a separate slide for is the Best Workplaces for Commuters. That's a program that's run by staff over at Cutter. It used to be an EPA program. Basically, employers just need to provide one primary benefit and a minimum of 3 secondary benefits. Among those secondary benefits, things like emergency ride home, and providing commute alternative information, TBARTA helps with. Our staff is also trained to help put together an application. In the state of Florida, it's free. So if you know of any employers that you think would like to get this national recognition for Best Workplaces for Commuters, please let us know. We'd be happy to reach out to them. And that is my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Does anybody here on the phone have any questions? Go ahead.
Just one question about the emergency ride home. Is the 6 ride limit now in place?
It is. Yeah, actually, Bob, all of our transit partners, we delivered interior bus posters. So for you, they were delivered to Alyssa. So those should be going up inside all the buses because our transit riders qualify for emergency ride home. They just need to go into their Commute Tampa Bay account and log their trips so they can get the appropriate number of points.
Great, thanks.
One thing you may want to keep in mind is we're looking to initiate a transportation management organization for the Gateway area. There was one years and years and years ago, and as a result of the master plan, that's now being revisited. And over the next maybe year to 2 years, we'll be looking to figure out a way to make that happen. They'll need a funding mechanism to do some of the things that they need to do. But I would encourage you to keep that in mind. And if we can sit down with, is it Terry, Pinellas County
Terry
representative?
Pinellas.
Then maybe we could strategize on that together.
Sure, absolutely. And we want to get Katina too from FDOT because as a TMO, they would be able to apply for some of that CAP funding. Absolutely. Good question.
I just wanted to mention the website, the platform that you recently got on. It's the same platform that is used in District 1 and District 5. It's just has a different name.
Yes.
So when you talk about regionalism, I think this is a great example of working together. The citizens really don't see the lines, the county lines. This way they'll be able to travel from the East Coast, if they want to, all the way to the West Coast and gain, you know, those carpool partners or van pools. So we're really excited about this. And
yeah, we work really closely too with your vendor. So a trans system that operates your commuter program, Annie, actually I have a call with her tomorrow. And then Stephen, who operates in District 5, also trans system. So The three of us talk regularly, and we've been meeting quarterly, so we can talk about making sure that our programs, that we all know what each other's doing. So we do have that, like, super regional coordination going on.
Great, thank you. There's no more questions, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
We'll move on to number 6. Anybody go around the board here, and anybody have any updates they would like to state? I'm seeing a bunch of heads shaking no. If anybody on the phone has anything they want to state, go right ahead.
I've got one thing. It's Bob at PSDA. First and foremost, I have to thank both Whit and David for their support letters for our low emission, no emission grant ask, which we're working on this week. And I know you mentioned earlier we didn't have hard people there. You may have seen in the media, they're starting to promote our new flamingo fairs, which have been in beta testing all this month. It's been a long time coming, but it looks like it's finally moving along. And people ask about our BRT project. From what I hear from the project manager, he says that latest word from FTA is everything looks like it's a go, so it's kind of an any day now anticipation for our funding. And that's about it from BSDA.
Anybody else on the phone would like to say anything? Any old or new business for the group?
Now, I would just like to maybe reiterate my request earlier that we look into the voting status of the CCC representative of this body.
Will do. Anybody else on the phone have anything? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to dismiss.
Make the motion.
So moved.
And everyone's shaking their head, so I won't even have to go for a vote. Every vote, say aye, and thank you all for coming. And please, next time, I think we're going to have a really big presentation going forward, so please encourage your fellow members to show up. Thanks.
Will do. Thanks, everybody.